Scarlet Nexus is amongst the first big anime games of a new generation of consoles. Bandai Namco has provided me with an early code for the final game so I could bring you a review for this gorgeous action RPG. My goal today is to tell you exactly what makes this game special and also highlight a few of my problems with it. So by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what you're buying. My name is Globku and this is my review for Scarlet Nexus.
This aptitude test will determine your platoon assignment. Do your best.
Yes, sir!
Scarlet Nexus starts showing its uniqueness right from the start. You can either pick Yuito or Kasane as your protagonist. What's different from most games is the fact that you're not simply picking your main character's gender, you are picking a completely different character with its own playstyle, its own abilities, talent trees, and its own story. Yuito and Kasane start in a very similar place. They're both new recruits in the OSF, a special force that protects citizens from these creatures called Others, using a variety of powers in what the developers are calling a brain-punk world. But very soon after, they are each placed in their own squad and their story begins to diverge. Ultimately, it converges and you uncover many world secrets which will be shared across both stories, but the pace and the order at which you discover these differs between the two of them. Having played with Yuito first, there were moments where I could simply not comprehend Kasane's behavior and started to see her as something of a villain. But then everything makes sense once you learn everything that she had experienced. More than most games, Scarlet Nexus encourages you to finish it with one character and then continue playing in New Game Plus with the other character. Because even if Kasane told me what she went through in my first playthrough as Yuito, the things she saw and shared with me sometimes were a bit too crazy to be believed, that I just had to experience them for myself. In fact, if I had to summarize the story in 3 words, those would be what the fuck. It goes beyond what anyone is expecting. It is absolutely crazy in a very, very good way. The story carries a lot of this game and has made me a fan. Scarlet Nexus is launching its own anime in July and I couldn't be more excited to see what they have in store. I'm in love with the world they've built, with the characters, and even though the game is pretty long, I was left wanting to know more, which is a very good sign. This being a review, we have to talk about story without spoiling anything, but the story really is the biggest reason why I like this game, because the two perspectives are incredibly well built, and they have their own twist that you could really start with either character and have a wonderful experience either way. It's a game that keeps introducing new foreign elements, it plays with mystery and keeps you confused and asking questions, and once it starts answering some of those questions, it makes you ask even more, so there's always a new thread to chase. And given how crazy it gets, it's very unpredictable on where it will go next, which kept me hooked the whole way through. If the story resonates with you as well as it did with me, I have no doubt you will enjoy Scarlet Nexus. Yuito's playthrough took me 23 hours to beat, and that was while doing a lot of side content. Not all of it, but a lot. So if you're a completionist doing everything on both playthroughs, this could easily be a 50-hour game. And it's really impressive when a story can hold you through all of that. And honestly, that's something the game needed. Because gameplay-wise, I don't think it's good enough to hold you for that long without such an amazing story carrying it. The main story is divided into different chapters. While a chapter is happening, you're encouraged to keep playing it. Usually, a chapter will have a ton of cutscenes and dialogue, both up front, in the end, and between activities. Gameplay-wise, you're usually playing in one of these areas that have a pretty linear path, with a few dead ends to explore where you can grab some consumable items, defeat a few extra enemies, and gather resources that you can later trade for cosmetics, gifts, or new equipment. There's a good variety of environments and it was fun to discover them, but a lot of them aren't that fun to navigate, which is bad when the game makes you repeat them. The story will return to a few areas over its course, and on top of that, there are side activities that also encourage you to revisit them. Not to mention, Yuito and Kasane have a couple of unique areas that they play in, but for the most part, the areas will be the same. Between story chapters though, you have a standby phase. This is where you and your allies will rest at the hideout. And this is the perfect time to go out there and do some side missions and bonding episodes with your crew. You can raise your bond level with any of your crewmates by giving them gifts, which you will find in the world, or make yourself by exchanging certain items at the store, and these gifts become physical objects in the hideout. Characters will use them as decoration or sometimes even interact with them between missions. And you also raise your bond level by going out on bonding missions with your friends. Leveling up a bond can give you certain bonuses when you use that character's ability. It could be something as simple as increasing its duration or straight up give you a new effect in battle. So these are definitely worth doing. Besides, they're responsible for a lot of the character building and are mostly entertaining and well written too. Side missions missions, on the other hand, barely have any writing to them and require you to do some menial tasks. They're the only missions in game that don't have voice acting and pretty much require you to either give certain items or kill specific monsters in specific ways. Side missions don't expire though, so you can just accept them and do them as you complete story missions, but most of them will require you to kill monsters in areas that you will not return to. That said, once you're done, you can complete them directly from the menu, so at least you won't have to return to your quest giver. You don't have to do any of this, however. As soon as one story chapter is done, you can just start the next one. The standby phase is completely optional, but it has its benefits if you choose to engage with it. And as previously mentioned, once you finish the story, you're encouraged to start over with another character. But for a game that has been built with the idea of 2 playthroughs, it is very weird that you can keep your character level and equipment, but every enemy around you goes back to level 1, which means you'll be a high-level character defeating enemies with 1 attack. The start of my New Game Plus was very painful gameplay-wise because nothing was challenging, and because these were low-level enemies, I didn't level up for the longest time. And it gives you all the tutorial tips again, as if I didn't just finish the game, and there's no option to disable them. Once again, the story really carries most of it. With this easy to understand structure, it should be obvious that aside from the cutscenes, what you do in these missions is mostly run around finding items that you turn into equipments or gifts, but most of the time what you're doing is fighting the monsters. Scarlet Nexus is a decent hack and slash action RPG, but doesn't stand out from other games in the same genre. The coolest thing about combat is probably the unique abilities that your allies have. As a part of the squad, you can borrow your teammates' powers, which are all very unique. You can burn enemies with fire, you can teleport, you can electrify them, and so on, which is another aspect that makes it worth playing through with both characters. They're both in different squads, which means that for most of the game you'll have access to a completely different array of abilities depending on who you play with. On their own, Yuito and Kasane also have different playstyles. Even though they both have the same power, psychokinesis, which allows them to telepathically throw objects around you at your enemies, Yuito's weapon of choice is the sword, so he fights at close range, while Kasane fights using these flying knives from a mid-range position. Yuito is a powerhouse on the ground, while Kasane has more options in the air. At its core, they play a very similar game. You attack your opponents with melee attacks and psychokinesis until you either drain their health or their stun meter, at which point you can perform a cinematic finisher. Draining the stun meter is usually easier if you use the correct teammates' abilities. Some enemies are weak to fire, so borrowing Hanabi's power will drain it a lot quicker. There are also some stronger objects in the field that can be thrown with your psychokinesis using a different button, and these usually trigger a quick time event that's unique to the type of object you've thrown. Some of them are so unique, in fact, that you can use them to traverse spaces really fast while defeating a bunch of enemies on the way. However, I'd say that combat feels rather limited when you first start playing. A lot of the fun abilities are locked behind the talent tree. Combos feel very stiff, there aren't a lot of options on how to fight until you start unlocking bigger combos, air options, and even the ability to combine powers. And when you're done with the talent tree, this combat has a lot of options, so many in fact, that I often felt like I was forgetting to use some of them, given how much I could do. But ultimately, this talent tree feels less like a way to upgrade my abilities and more like a barrier that stood in the way of a really good combat system. In addition to the talent tree, you also have a very light layer of RPG equipment, with a weapon slot and 3 plug-in slots, which are items that give you passive buffs. You can upgrade your main character and all your companions with a weapon and 3 passive items. The weapons don't really change, they're just upgraded, so they may change visually, but their moveset remains the same and they deal more damage. The passive items though do give you some slight customization. You can choose to be a bit more aggressive with damage buffs, or go a bit more defensive with defense and health. But keeping all my companions upgraded throughout the game can definitely be a big chore. But it's a chore that you absolutely do not need to go through. Having more damage is nice, but you can focus on the main character, leaving the supports with basic items. The game won't punish you too much for that. You can also customize your characters and partners visually, separate from their stats equipment, and this visual customization will actually persist through cutscenes. So you can go all out, making someone look ridiculous or even cooler than before. The RPG aspect is very light and is mostly carried by the talent tree, and unfortunately, the issues with combat don't end there. There are a lot of enemy types throughout the game, and even though you're getting more options on how to defeat them, most of them feel very similar to fight against. The same strategies from the start of the game will also apply to the end of it, and that even applies to boss fights, who often just feel like bigger enemies with more health. This game has its fair share of cool boss fights with unique mechanics, but unfortunately, those don't happen too often. While fighting, the game also occasionally has some camera issues, which is very common in these 3D action games. They're not that frequent, but can be frustrating when they happen. Overall, Scarlet Nexus is a decent action RPG gameplay-wise, but gameplay alone will definitely not carry it for 50 hours. This game is an absolute joy to look at. I played it on a PS5 at 1080p 60 frames per second with no performance issues. I know the game is capable of 4K, but I can't speak to how well it runs at that resolution. I'm still waiting for my 4K monitor. Not every area in the game is that gorgeous to look at, but some certainly had me stopping to appreciate the view. And the characters are all gorgeous. Most of the story is told in this new visual novel style with character portraits talking to each other, with animated screenshots changing on the background. I did feel like some of these scenes could have been CG animated. The slideshow style isn't great for actions, but don't you worry, there are plenty of CG cutscenes to enjoy. The game constantly alternates between these two styles, seamlessly transitioning from one to the other. And the graphics, the animation work is all top-notch. Easily one of the best looking anime games released so far. All accompanied by a soundtrack that I've now downloaded and I'm listening to on repeat. Sometimes it goes too far in the dubstep realm, which feels a bit outdated, but most of it not only fits the vibe of the game, it also feels very unique and gives Scarlet Nexus its own identity. It's a soundtrack that's good enough to listen to even outside of the game, and that's something that I don't do very often. The whole game is also voiced in English and Japanese. I mostly played it in English, as it can be really hard to read subtitles in the middle of the action. And characters do talk a lot during combat, especially during boss fights, and I didn't want to miss that dialogue. The bonding missions are also completely voiced. The only thing that is not voiced are the side missions, but those barely have any narrative value anyway. With all that said, it's time to score this game. If you're new here, we use letters as our review scores. It goes from F, which is a really bad game, all the way up to A, which is a really good game. And this is my score for Scarlet Nexus. It's an okay action game that doesn't really do much wrong, but it gets really repetitive since enemies fail to challenge you in unique ways. So it becomes a game that you can kinda just autopilot through. But then it's topped with an incredible story, full of unexpected turns that has made me care enough about it to play through it twice. It is hard recommending a game based on story alone though. If it doesn't resonate with you, you might feel like you've wasted your money, and that's totally valid. But as a reviewer, I can only talk and score games according to my own experience, and to me, this story is phenomenal. And that's Scarlet Nexus. If you've played it yourself, let everybody know what you thought of it in the comments down below. That way, if someone comes to this video wondering if they should buy it, they have my opinion, but they can read yours as well. And as always, thank you very much for watching. My name is Globku, and I'll see you next time. Bye!